Okay, welcome everybody to tonight's Science in the City. We'll go ahead and get started, and those who are still entering, just grab a seat wherever. We also have some extra seats over here on my right side. But just really quickly, I'm just going to set expectations for the evening, do a quick introduction of our speaker tonight, as well as some other programs that are coming up, and then we'll be off and running. So my name is Brett, so welcome everybody, hello. I am the host and moderator for the Science in the City program here at Pacific Science Center, and I just want to say thank you for being here with us tonight. Format for tonight is that our speaker will speak for roughly about 45-50 minutes, after which we'll have time up until about 8:30, 8:45 for Q&A with the speaker, and then there's some time afterwards that you can have informal talks with them down here on the stage, or if you want to come down and look at their props, you can do that as well. So just a reminder that Science in the City is an opportunity to join Pacific Science Center for lively conversations with scientists and experts and learn about scientific and technological achievements in topics that are relevant to our city and our region. So thank you again. Also a reminder that if you are not a member with us, these events are free for our members, and quite honestly, if you're just doing like a single person membership, then you basically just come to all the Science in the Cities for free, and it's pretty cool. So something that I'll first go to here. So restrooms, if you need facilities tonight, head out to your left. They're camouflage wood doors. Go outside the hallway that you'll find. Head downstairs, and that's where the bathrooms will be. When you come back, you'll want to re-enter through the blue doors. If those are locked, you can just come back the direction that you left in. Something that I want to share with you, and we're pretty excited about this, we have a new series with the NHL Seattle groups and OVG. So the group that is doing the renovation, the rebuild, over at Key Arena. So it's now the new arena at Seattle Center, and we are doing a presentation next week on the 23rd that's about acoustics at the new arena, and we're putting in some pretty big shots to talk about that engineering feat that's happening. That is a $10 price, just because we are offering food, but again, it's free for our members, so hopefully I'll see some of you there as well. And then I don't have a picture for it, but on the upcoming, or the next week, April 30th, we have another talk about the Salish Sea. It's going to be a documentary movie about what you'll find in the Salish Sea, and talking about the health of salmon and orca and other really kind of, big named species that live in that part. So that's called Beneath the Salish Sea, and that's also $10. So tonight I am delighted to introduce you to our speaker. We'll be hearing from Kees, Beemster, Leverenz tonight from Mysteries of the Deep, Seattle's Underwater Secrets. And just to give you a brief bio about Kees before he joins us here at the podium, is that he's an enthusiastic diver and global underwater explorer instructor from Seattle, Washington, who enjoys exploring our underwater world as often as possible. Kees is passionate about sharing his love of diving by both teaching and contributing to both local and global documentation projects. So at this time, I would like you all to join me in welcoming Kees to the podium.
Hi. Hey everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm really excited to talk tonight because basically you've all come out to hear me talk about my favorite stuff to talk about. And if you know me, which I think a lot of you do, you know how much I can't shut up about diving. So, my presentation has decided to minimize itself. Let me try that one more time. Right. So thank you. Just out of curiosity, and by show of hands, who here in the audience knows how to dive themselves? Okay, so about half of folks. I did give out 3D glasses, and there are going to be, I think, a couple more 3D glasses just from Pacific Science Center. They're going to come out. I wasn't sure how well the 3D glasses thing was going to work, so the entire presentation actually doesn't use those, even though I do show some 3D stuff. But at the end, we're going to try it just because it's fun and because I had a bunch of spare 3D glasses left over from before. So you can look forward to that, but it'll be a little bit more informal at the end. And then, of course, if you've got any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll do my best to answer them at any time, just because I'm going to try to keep things reasonably formal, because I don't think I've ever actually spoken to a crowd this large before. So, again, thank you for coming. So, my name is Kees. I'm here representing an organization called Global Underwater Explorers. Global Underwater Explorers is probably best described as a bunch of dive nerds that banded together so that we could all be nerds together in a big group. We're a global organization. We have smaller chapters in 91 different countries, with sort of a big epicenter here in the United States and over in Europe, with a bunch of folks down in Mexico, South America, and a lot of other places around the world. Global Underwater Explorers, our motto is education, exploration, and conservation. Basically, everything grew out of a couple of large exploration projects where divers were trying to do something ambitious. In particular, a cave exploration project in Florida called the Woodsville Karst Plain Project, where a group of divers were trying to explore a cave that was at the bottom of a 300-foot basin. And if you know anything about diving, you know that diving at 300 feet is no small issue, especially if you were going to try to do it for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or more. Some of the dives that they've done for that project have stretched past a day underwater, which is pretty significant. And so back when Global Underwater Explorers was founded about 20 years ago, it was born out of that project and sort of the standardization that they worked out in that to manage the difficulty of keeping people in the water for that long. Divers don't always necessarily recognize the benefits of standardization, but if you go and you look at like an ambulance or you look at an airplane, it'd be awful hard if in one airplane turning the yoke to the right made it turn the wrong direction. Think about switching the gas and the brake pedal in your car. It'd be kind of difficult. So we try to standardize a lot of stuff, and that allows us to focus a lot more of our efforts on exploration and maybe a little bit less on equipment. But again, we're big nerds, so we love equipment, and we spend a lot of time talking about that anyway. I brought some here just because it's just fun to look at. So that's Global Underwater Explorers. We've been around for about 20 years. And me. My name is Kees Leverenz, as I think I've said like 3 or 4 times now. This is me and a good friend of mine, Alex, who's out here in the crowd, diving on a 500-year-old warship in Sweden that I'll talk a little bit more about later in the presentation. I teach diving. I teach classes for divers who, in particular, who want to work with Global Underwater Explorers, who want to learn some of the techniques that we teach and so on. And I also teach a class on documentation techniques on some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about tonight and how we make 3D models out of stuff underwater. Okay, so Puget Sound. A lot of folks here are divers. I'm willing to bet that a reasonable number of you have learned somewhere that's maybe a little bit clearer, maybe a little bit warmer, and maybe a little bit less intimidating than the cold waters that we are in here. However, there's a truckload of stuff to see in Puget Sound. If you can get over it being a little bit chilly and a little bit cloudy, which is not too dissimilar from Seattle on the surface, you can really start to see a ton of cool stuff. So this is a map of Lake Washington. Over here is Seattle and Elliott Bay, and up at the top is Lake Union. And these are just a couple of the targets of the wrecks and things that we've identified in collaboration with the greater dive community in Seattle that are of interest to us. Not all of these are things that we've even been to yet, so there's a good opportunity that if you go out on a weekend, with the right folks, that you could go dive on something that nobody necessarily has ever been to before, or at least hasn't been to since it was floating or flying. So this is pretty cool, and this extends in Elliott Bay and Puget Sound all the way up into BC. So if you have any interest, if you're a diver and you have any interest in going and exploring, don't limit yourself just to traveling and doing it on vacation. I do that myself, but there's plenty of stuff here, and we're going to focus mostly on wrecks and targets and things that I find interesting in the Puget Sound. So I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about a couple of really cool wrecks and particular sources of wrecks that have been around or that have occurred over the course of about the last 100 years. Obviously, Seattle's a pretty new city, so the majority of the things that have sunk are relatively new, and that has advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is there's no really cool old stuff, But the advantage is that most of the things that are down there are in relatively good shape. Seattle also has a big history of like maritime shipping and so on. So we have things like this, the A.J. Fuller. The A.J. Fuller sits right out in Elliott Bay. In fact, if you were to get on the passenger ferry that takes people from West Seattle over to downtown, or the Washington State ferry, if it were to divert slightly, there's a chance that you drive over the wreck of the A.J. Fuller, which is a cargo ship that sank in 1918, and I think is particularly cool because it's probably the closest thing to a pirate ship that we have around here. So it's a three-masted schooner, sort of towards the end of the age where transporting things via sail was economically feasible, but it was quite fast. Towards the end of its life, they were using it as a salmon cannery ship, and it was sitting out in the middle of Elliott Bay with 80 crew members on shore leave after presumably being on a long cruise, and just 3 guys sort of keeping watch out on the ship itself. It was a foggy morning, and another ship called the Mexico Maru came in, hit the A.J. Fuller, and then continued on their way, allowing the Fuller to promptly sink. So the 3 guys inside the A.J. Fuller, they obviously heard the fact that they got hit by another ship, a large steamship in this case. They ran up to the top deck, jumped in a lifeboat, and bailed out. And the ship sank with all of its cargo and basically everything on board still. Ultimately, and somewhat unsurprisingly, the moored ship was not declared responsible. It was the Mexico Maru, this other cargo ship, that was declared responsible, that sped off with parts of the A.J. Fuller still embedded in its anchor. And they ended up getting fined about $500,000, which back in 1918 was the equivalent of about $8 or $9 million bucks. So that's kind of a hard hit to take for that other crew. You know, you sort of imagine that they wish that they were looking where they were going a little bit better. They did toy around, the A.J. Fuller, they toyed around with bringing it up or bringing things up, but it rests in about 250 feet of water, and it's Puget Sound, so it's cold and it's dark and it's challenging, so they didn't end up actually doing that. What they did do was send a hard hat diver to try to recover some stuff from the deck. They couldn't send him all the way down, so what they did is they actually sent him down to stand on the top of the mast with a hook and try to reach down and grab stuff from the deck of the ship, which he actually successfully did. He recovered like a non-negligible amount of cargo from the top of the boat, which I just think is a hilarious image, because it's like a guy in one of those big brass helmets hanging onto the mast of a ship with a hook trying to recover things. So that's the successful salvage from the A.J. Fuller. So if the A.J. Fuller is an example of some of the cargo ships that we've had sort of traveling around the Seattle area for quite some time, we also have an example of a number of ferries. Seattle has one of the largest ferry systems in the world, and it has for quite some time. Before there were cars, though, we didn't have large ships that were sort of roll-on, roll-off ferries, but we had a number of smaller passenger ferries that helped shuttle people around the area. For example, from Seattle to Tacoma, or from Seattle to Bellevue on Lake Washington, or around Lake Union. And these 2 boats that you see up front here, this is a colorized but historic photo. These 2 ships up front are sort of representative of what those kinds of old steamers would look like. They're these little white boats, very nice, and there's actually still quite a few of them at the bottom of Elliott Bay and Lake Washington and Lake Union. Somewhat unsurprisingly, when bridges started going in and people started getting cars, and there were a lot of these ferries still around for people to use, they started mysteriously going up in flames after insurance policies were taken out on them. So we find a couple of these, but not all of them are in excellent shape. Some of them have been stripped of anything of value, in particular, like all the way down to toilets. And if you find a ship that doesn't have a toilet on it anymore, you know that people were really scrounging for things before it accidentally sank. So on top of passenger ferries that we have and members of the Mosquito fleet, other small ships that sort of serviced the industry of Seattle over the course of the past 100 years, we also had the Naval Air Station Seattle, NASC Seattle. Some of you may not know this, but Magnuson Park actually used to be this large naval air station from before World War II, or excuse me, from before World War I to after World War II. So you see a historic photo on the left of what it looked like before, and then a more recent photo now that it's been transitioned into Magnuson Park, which is really quite a nice park. But not everybody knows, safety standards weren't quite what they are today back in the 1950s, 40s, 30s, and etc. So there are actually quite a few airplanes that have sunk off of NASC Seattle that are largely still down there. In fact, there's two of them, two of probably the best wrecks in Seattle, are just off the edge of Magnuson Park, where nobody's ever able to really see them unless you go diving, but they're there, and they've been there for 60, 70 years, and they're largely in perfect shape, sort of remnants of what of the old naval air station. So that one of them is about 135 feet, and one is about 150 feet. So they're on the deeper side of things for sure. So they, while there is a lot of cool stuff in Lake Washington and Puget Sound, there are a number of significant challenges to documenting these wrecks. I mean, of course, it's all well and good to have this interesting stuff, and it's really fun to go visit it yourself. But it's always nice to be able to bring back a picture or some video or something that you might be able to show your friends and family that don't dive or other divers who aren't able to reach that particular target or haven't had a chance to yet. The number one difficulty that we run into is visibility. So this is actually one of the airplanes that's right off of Magnuson Park, and this is probably a good day with about as much light as we can possibly put onto it. And even with that, you're able to only see about 5 or 10 feet in front of you. If you're down there and you're sort of able to see each section in sequence and you do it over a couple of dives, you get a pretty good idea of what it looks like. But it's still really challenging to get a nice picture or to get a video that really engages with anybody. As you can see here, sort of a blurry, muddy mess, which is not super engaging. One of the other challenges that we run into, which is something that we mentioned before, is depth. So not all of the wrecks in Puget Sound or in Lake Washington are deep, but it is a glacial lake, which means that at one point a glacier kind of swept through and dug a big trench. And so a lot of the stuff in the lake is between about 150 and 200 feet. Now, when you're doing a dive to somewhere between 0 and 100 feet, typically you take a couple minutes to go down, you spend the vast majority of your time exploring and having fun, and then you have a couple minutes to come back up. And if anything goes wrong, you just come straight to the surface, it's no big deal. So that's 0 to 100 feet. However, most of the time in Lake Washington, we're dealing with stuff in about 100 to 200 foot range. And in that range, we start having to worry about decompression sickness, what some people may know as the bends. So in that area, if you spend enough time, you really need to make a slow ascent to the surface. So for example, if we were to go to 150 feet and spend a half an hour there, we'd have to spend another half an hour just coming up. Sometimes there's something fun to see, but a lot of the time, we just end up staring into our buddy's eyes and making an uncomfortable amount of eye contact. So, not ideal, and something that we would avoid if we could, but we can't, so we don't. There are a couple of wrecks, like the A.J. Fuller that I mentioned, that are below 200 to 300 feet, and basically what happens is the amount of time that you have to spend coming up goes up from there. So where at 150 feet, might be 30 minutes on the bottom and 30 minutes coming up. At 250 feet, it might be 20 or 30 minutes on the bottom and 60 or 70 minutes coming up, which is really a lot of time. And of course, because if you skip that, you could risk injuring yourself, you also have to start worrying about, well, if something happens down here, I'm going to need to resolve that issue underwater. So one of the big challenges that we run into is the fact that we have this limited time because we don't want to spend too much time coming up. And also, we need to make sure that the folks that are coming with us on the deeper dives are pretty good divers and have the specialized training that you need to be able to do that kind of stuff. That being said, our descents are really fast. Human bodies are really totally fine with adjusting to increasing pressure and going deep. It's just the decreasing pressure that really messes us up. Okay, so when we're doing like a deeper dive, we have a number of strategies to basically bring enough gas for us to breathe while we're down there. On the right hand here, you see my friend Alex again, who I basically take pictures of nonstop. So most of the pictures that I have that are mine are of him, or my friend Marcus, as of last week when we got back from a big trip. But here he is on open circuit. And open circuit is a pretty simple piece of equipment, and we like simple because simple means it's also super reliable. Open circuit is just about as easy as you can get. You have a big tank on your back. It has a lot of air or a lot of another breathing gas in it. You breathe it, and then when you're done, you just exhale into the water. Very straightforward. If we need more gas or a different variety of gas, we just start adding tanks on until we start to look like a Christmas tree. That being said, there are some limitations with that. Just like in almost anything else, if you have an opportunity to recycle some of your gas, you can get some advantages out of it. So I like to think of open circuit sort of like a gas car. You fill it up, it goes, and it's done. If you brake or something like that, like you slow down, you don't really get any benefit from it. They're not very good in the city. They're not very good in like certain situations. On the other hand, we have the equipment that we have on the left and that I brought mine of here, which is called a rebreather. And a rebreather will actually recycle some of the gas that we use. That makes it a lot easier for us to spend more time underwater exploring stuff, especially down deep, because we're not constantly dumping all of the gas that we're breathing. We have that opportunity to kind of recycle, a little bit like a hybrid car works. You still have to fill it up with gas, you just don't end up using quite so much of it. Okay. On top of all that, if it wasn't enough to have to worry about poor visibility and cold temperatures and decompression sickness and solving all of our problems underwater, there's also something called nitrogen narcosis. Some of you may have heard of it as called rapture of the deep. What happens is basically, past about 100 feet, the deeper that you go, if you're just breathing normal air like the vast majority of divers do, you start to feel drunk. And just like it's not a good idea to go drunk driving, it's not a good idea to go drunk diving. So we want to mitigate that. And the way that we do that is by swapping out some of the nitrogen in our mixture for helium. So I just happened to bring a tank with helium.
So on a really deep dive, we start to sound like this, which is hilarious when you're actually trying to get work done and your buddy is yelling at you, sounding like Mickey Mouse.
There's not actually a lot of oxygen in that mixture, so. So we blend things up and we mix things up and we sort of take every advantage that we can possibly get. We're not really big on giving the ocean a fighting chance. Anywhere we can, we'll spend a little bit of extra money, we'll spend a little bit of extra time, we'll build up our own skills in whatever way that we can so that we have the best odds that are possible. So in this case, it means typically adding some helium to the mix for our deep dives, which is perfectly fine except for maybe a little bit expensive if you don't recycle any of it. So on top of all of those challenges, it ends up being very dark. After about 70 feet in Lake Washington, after maybe 100 feet on a bright summer day in Puget Sound, there's very rarely all that much light. So what we do is, again, we stack the odds in our favor. We bring strobes, I bring buddies, and I make my buddies carry lights for me. The brightest lights that I can possibly find. So this is this is a light bar that one of our lighting divers would carry on some of our documentation dives. So I always warn people not to look into them when I turn them on, because you'll go blind for a second, and it's not really all that pleasant. Sometimes we bring 6 lights like this on a single dive, and still, they're a little fiddly. Still, that can be not quite enough. So I'm going to try to turn these off, and we're going to see if I actually can. There we go. Okay. Now if everybody's eyes are adjusted, I know mine aren't. So we bring a ton of light, and that certainly helps, but it's still nothing compared to the sun. Nothing's ever going to be as good compared to the sun. So we also bring a camera that's as good at gathering light as we possibly can, which is just a normal sort of high-end consumer camera that we put into an underwater housing like this that allows us to manipulate all the controls, but keep the camera dry. I've never tried putting my camera underwater without the housing, but I'm told that it doesn't function very well. If anybody would like to try it at home in like a bathtub or something like that, just let me know how that goes for you, but I accept no responsibilities. Okay, so we have all of these problems of documenting stuff underwater, and we've been running into this for years and years and years of folks come. They go, they dive, they see something really cool in Puget Sound or in Lake Washington or Lake Union, and they come back up with these photos and these videos that, while they're super cool, are maybe not as cool as the actual experience of going and diving them. So that's basically been a problem for a long time, and something that we hadn't really come up with a good solution for. Until a couple of years ago, one of our colleagues at Global Underwater Explorers discovered this. This is the Mars. It's a flagship. It's sunk in 1564, and it's at the bottom of the Baltic, where the conditions are really quite similar to the conditions here in Seattle. They're cold, they're dark, visibility is so-so on a good day, and it's quite deep. It's about 250 feet. So the question becomes, how do you document this? And the solution that they came up with there was, we're going to get really close to it, and we're going to take a picture of everything, every inch of the entire wreck, multiple times, and then feed it into this software that lets us build a 3D model of the entire thing. And once you have a 3D model, you can basically say, instead of having bad visibility, let's have perfect visibility, right? And so what you're able to do is, even though you would never be able to see the entire wreck like this, on an actual dive, what you can do is you can see the entire wreck like this by stitching together all of these little photos. This is an enormous project that they're still in the process of finishing. It's like a 10-year project because it's such a deep wreck. It's owned by the Swedish government. It's culturally significant to them, and it's just huge. It's just a huge project. In fact, some of the processing of the photos of this wreck took over 16 months to complete with a specialty-built server that was designed specifically for that process. That gives you an idea of the challenge of doing this on a wreck like that. But that gave us an idea. If they can do it on something this big, well, a lot of our wrecks happen to be quite a bit smaller than that. So maybe we can do the same thing and digitally remove some of the bad visibility and allow us to document our wrecks in a way that can engage with people, that can engage with other divers, and that can, sort of satisfy our need to have a cool picture of a wreck, too. So we reached out to the folks that are involved in this process, and there wasn't a defined way of doing things, but they were able to give us a lot of the resources and sort of point us in the right direction on how to do things. So what we did is, instead of trying in Lake Washington, we went out to Lake Crescent, where it's still cold and stuff is still deep, and we still run into a lot of those challenges, but the water is clear, which is really lovely. And the targets are very small, which makes the process much, much easier. So the first target that we looked at, the first thing that we thought about trying to model in 3D in this way, is this wreck called the Warren Car. Now, the Warren Car is kind of a sad story. If anybody has been to Lake Crescent, you know that the sides are very steep and the road is just barely chiseled into the side. It's extremely windy, lots of hairpin turns. In 1929, the road was neither paved nor did it have guardrails. So the Warren family was a husband and wife. They had 2 kids that were back at home, and they were bringing a washer back, presumably to make their life a little bit easier, to basically a logging camp. Unfortunately, they were driving back on a rainy night, on this dirt road on the steep side of a lake, and they basically vanished, and nobody knew what happened to them. A lot of people assumed that they had run off the road because that was a logical conclusion, and it turned out in 2002 that they were able to find the car, find the remains, and confirm that theory. Fortunately, the National Park Service and the group of local divers that did the discovery were able to get in touch with the descendants of the Warren family, place a memorial, and bring the remains to rest. However, for our documentation purposes, this makes a great target, and since it's no longer a grave, we had the blessing of the family, sort of a win. So, we tried to make this model, and we ended up with this. Is there any chance that we could kill some of these lights? Just so that it's, a lot of the stuff from here on out is a little bit on the darker side. So this wreck in particular was really successful, largely because we were able to put a lot of light onto it, and because we were able to see almost the entire thing in every picture, because the target itself is relatively small. This particular car took about 200 images to put together, and that's where they were all taken from. So you can see basically the diver, Catherine Arant, who took all of these photos. She swam around, click, 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 and she had a friend that was lighting everything up for her, and she had ambient light, and we were able to stitch it together pretty easily and build a lot of enthusiasm within the local global underwater, on the local global underwater explorers community, and start working on some of the more challenging projects that would prove to be far, far more challenging than this one. Before I jump into that, though, I just want to talk briefly about how the software works. So, I like to think of it, it's sort of like a photo mosaic. If you have a bunch of photos, like a panorama, maybe the kind that your phone puts together, where you've taken a picture here, 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 and software or a person is able to sort of sort those things out, match things up, and you end up with a nice wide, big photo that's way wider than your camera would ever be able to take normally. That's sort of what's going on here. The software first goes in and looks at every photo, and it tries to find little things that it can identify in each one of the pictures. In particular, it looks for things that it might be able to identify in multiple pictures. Then it takes all of those thousands of little points, compares them to other images, and tries to line things up. It's smart enough to be able to see a particular point from multiple angles and determine that it is the same thing. And when that happens with 3, 4, or 5 or more, sometimes quite a few more points, it's actually able to determine where those two pictures were taken relative to each other. Now, when you stack that process up on top of hundreds or thousands of different photos, you're able to figure out what we have here, which is called a point cloud. It's sort of like a connect the dots image of the Warren car in this case. So you get a sense, sort of, of what it looks like, and you can see things like maybe the memorial or the headlight, kinda, but really it's just a bunch of dots. The important thing here is that the computer knows where the pictures were taken from. Or in some cases, it's told you that it can't figure out where the pictures were taken from, and you have to go you have to go be cold again. So the next step, if you've been successful on this first step, here we go, is to fill in some of the gaps. Once it knows where all the pictures were taken from, all of the points that it couldn't find a match for in a bunch of different images, well, all of a sudden it knows where those points were, because it can figure that out based on the placement of the images. So we start to build what's called a dense point cloud. It's really the same thing as the previous one, just a bunch of dots in space, but there's just way, way, way more dots until you start to see the actual shape of the object. Of course, if you want to do anything with this, like, say, bring it into another piece of software, make a scene out of it, see it in VR, or maybe make a print, like a 3D printed model of it, you can't very well tell something to print a bunch of points that float in space. So you have to stitch all of those things together. Just again, like connect the dots, you have to draw lines in between. So the next step is to make a mesh. And basically with the mesh, what you've done is you've connected all those dots to make a series of triangles. And hopefully, if things go well, and of course they only rarely go super well, you have then this flat surface. In this case, it worked pretty well. And if you look really close, you can see there's a little bit of roughness to it, but we stopped being a bunch of points and we started being a surface. Of course, the disadvantage of a mesh is that we've lost all the nice color that we got from the photos in the first place. So the last step is you ask the computer basically to take all of the images and project that image data onto the model that we've created. Sort of like spray painting it with the actual texture that was down there. And what we end up with is this, which is a textured mesh of the car. Now again, if you look really close, some places it can look a little bit jumbled, but the overall end result is pretty impressive. So you can see on the bottom, you can see all the mechanics of this car. It's similar to a Model T Ford, but it's made by Chevy. You can see the headlight and the memorial and the hubcap and the inflated tires. Here in the center, you can see the springs that were under the seat. If you were to look really closely, you might be able to make out the speedometer inside, the spare tire on the back, the bumper, and then, of course, a lot of the surrounding rocks that give you a sense of what this thing actually is and what actually happened to it. It's not just a car that's floating in space. This is a gravesite, and it's a memorial, and it's a wreck, and it's something historic. So I think that having all of those things in there really helps bring something that otherwise would be inaccessible to a lot of people sort of to the forefront of folks' minds. So the Warren car was all well and good, but the original idea was to be able to do this on things in Lake Washington. Now, I showed you a picture of the cockpit of an airplane that crashed off of Magnuson Park. This wreck, the SL Dowel, is in similar conditions. It's super cool. It was built in 1899, sunk in 1922. It's in wonderful shape. Some of the original rope that's been down there for, 80, 90 years, I guess close to 100 years, is still intact. The hinges on the doors still function despite the fact that it's been underwater for close to 100 years, although, of course, we try not to touch those as much as possible because we don't want to damage it. But you can see that the conditions underwater there don't really give you a sense of what this boat looks like. In fact, you can dive this a whole number of times and still only have sort of a so-so sense of what it looks like, even though it's only roughly the size of 2 large pickup trucks. Here you can see inside the wheelhouse, you can see what would have been the cabin. We picked this, it's on the deeper side, but we picked this because it was really convenient. In fact, today I can drive to the entry point for this wreck in about 5 minutes from my house. It's about 15 minutes from where we are right now if you were to drive fast. So, this was the first wreck that we had a chance to complete in Lake Washington. And so you get a much better sense, I think, of what that wreck actually looks like. Of course, there are a number of pretty big issues with this. For example, there actually is a roof, even though there's no roof here. And although it looks like it's perched on top of a pinnacle, it's not at all. It's on a totally flat bottom. On the back, there's no damage to the back, although you can read SL Dowel here on the model, the name of the ship, still after almost 100 years. And there's no blob here either. If you look really closely, over on the side here, right there, you might see a little patch of red. And that's almost omnipresent on wrecks in Lake Washington. It's a solo cut from a partier. I think none of the large wrecks in Lake Washington don't have at least one, and most have 2 or 3. I don't know why. I don't know why it's never a beer can or a white solo cup. It's always a red solo cup, but there you go. So this was our first shot at this in Lake Washington. We were like, okay, we're pretty enthusiastic about this. It's definitely a cool result, but that's not exactly something that you'd want to show off to a whole room of strangers. So we're gonna try to do a little bit better, maybe with something that has a little bit more historical significance. Of course, the old tug is cool, but it's hardly one of a kind. So we've been working on all of these things, and then early last year, we got contacted by a naval archaeologist, Megan, here in Seattle, And she'd been doing something similar on wrecks that were in slightly warmer, slightly clearer water, but she was really interested in airplanes. She is a naval archaeologist, a PhD, but her specialty was sunken airplanes. So she came to us and she said, hey, there's this one airplane, the PBM Mariner. It's in Lake Washington. Could you help me make a model? I have funding, if you make a successful model, to put it in the Pima Air Museum down in Arizona, next to the only intact version of this plane anywhere in the world. So of course we were like, yeah, that sounds awesome. It sounds like you've done all the hard work of securing funding for this. And all we have to go do is the diving part, which is what we would do anyways, what we have been doing anyways. And so we were like, yeah, we're in. So the PBM Mariner is a flying boat, and they're not very well survived, despite the fact that they were used really extensively in World War II for basically all of the things that they use a helicopter for today. So basically any time that the military needed to pick somebody up from the ocean, or that they needed to land somewhere where there wasn't a runway, which is pretty much all the time in the Pacific Theater and a lot of times in the Atlantic Theater, they used a flying boat. They're long range, they have a whole bunch of crew inside of them, and very useful. Now there were two different kinds of flying boats, the PBY Catalina and the PBM Mariner. The PBY Catalina is all over the place. In fact, they're still flying some of them down in California to fight wildfires. The PBM Mariner, I know of 3 that are intact. One is at the bottom of Lake Washington, one is at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and one of them is in the Pima Air Museum. So, pretty cool. The trick is that the PBY most frequently was built with wheels, and the PBM Mariner was typically only able to land in the water. So, towards the end of World War II, when they stopped being useful, they shipped a bunch of them out to other countries who subsequently scrapped them. And then anybody that wanted to keep one around in the United States basically had to find a big pier to float it at the end of. Nobody had that, so they ended up scrapping most of them. In fact, the one that did survive only survived because it was one of just a handful that was built with amphibious wheels, and so they were able to park it somewhere where they could store it inexpensively. So, again, conditions in Lake Washington, very cool if you go down there and you get an opportunity to actually swim around and see what you're seeing and sort of piece things together in your mind. But even with 4 of these big, huge lights that I blinded you with a couple of minutes ago, this is sort of what we get out of it. Just basically a little vignette of one tiny part of this airplane. You can't really tell, I can't tell what that is at all. This airplane actually is upside down, and after 2 recovery attempts by the Navy, is actually fairly heavily damaged, which is actually pretty typical of airplanes in the lake. There have been a lot of, the ones that are left, a lot of them have had an unsuccessful salvage attempt that damaged them, followed by the Navy deciding that it wasn't worth salvaging anymore. So our result from this was quite a bit better, because we had gotten a little bit better at doing this. So on this model, this is the PBM Mariner. It's the bottom of the flying boat, so it looks sort of like a boat hull because it's a boat hull. At the front, you can see the ball turret. You can see both engines. The Navy, when they decided that they weren't going to salvage it, decided to plug the holes in the side so that recreational divers wouldn't go inside. Not that anybody would do that, but lots of people did that before they patched the holes. On the back, they accidentally pulled off the tail when they were trying to recover it. So you can see in, and you might be able to see that little pillar in there, which is actually the base of the ball turret that would have defended it from enemy attacks. This particular airplane is cool even in the limited number of PBM Mariners that still exist, because it's the only known example anywhere of the most heavily armed variant. So it had a ball turret on the front, it had a ball turret on the top, it had one on the tail, and I think it may have even had some on the sides, but I'm not an expert. Anyways, so we're pretty happy with this result, but it did involve quite a bit more labor than we put into on the dowel. So, you know, they say sometimes you just have to put in the work, I guess. So what we were able to do with this is, instead of modeling the whole thing in one piece, we modeled it in a series of smaller chunks. And if a chunk didn't turn out, we'd go back and do it again. Then we took all of those chunks, and each one of those little points is something that we manually put in order to align those chunks together and create a cohesive model of the entire wreck. So if you remember, I showed you a picture of the Warren car with about 200 images that we took. This is what it looks like for this airplane, 550 images. That's about 6 dives, each somewhere between 45 and 50 minutes long, of me going around the airplane, click, 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 over and over and over and over. But the end result, I'm very happy with. Now, the PBM Mariner is cool. It's historically significant, and the Pima Air Museum was interested, so that's great. But it's kind of hard to relate to an upside-down boat. There's not a lot really going on there, as cool as it is as sort of a proof of concept of a historical wreck. Oh, yeah, here's a picture of it in the Pima Air Museum next to the tail section that they pulled off when they tried to recover it. Here's sort of our gold standard wreck, like the coolest one in the lake, in my opinion, and I think at least a number of folks' opinions that dive around here. While the PBM Mariner is upside down, the PB4Y is right side up and basically completely intact. All the tail surfaces, the wings are intact. The only damage, of course, is from the Navy damaging it when they tried to salvage it. So this is what a PBY privateer looks like. This one in particular, just after World War II, was loaded up for a training mission, and it was sitting on the tarmac waiting to go. And the pilot had gone through all the checklists. The weather was bad, and so they said, okay, you just go through all your checklists and just wait, and when the weather clears up, we'll let you go. And so he went through all of his checklists, and then they sat, and they sat, and they sat. And, you know, apparently he got distracted at some point because one of the checklist items never actually got checked off, which was he needed to put the flaps down for the kind of takeoff that he was going to do. In this particular case, what that meant is the airplane could fly when it was close to the ground, but not when it was far away from the ground, which is really not a situation that you want to have an airplane in. So finally he got the go-ahead. They said take off, pulls out on the runway, tries to take off, and he flew close to the ground, and then he tried to pull away from close to the ground, and he went right back to the ground, or in this case, to the water. There were 11 crew members on board. All of the crew members got out, and we were actually fortunate enough, this is recent enough that we were able to meet with one of the crew members that was on this plane when it went down, and he said one of his other crew members was a bit of a larger guy, and he was supposed to go out first through the hatch, but he was worried that he wasn't going to make it. So he was sitting down there pushing on the guy and trying to make sure that he could get out of the hatch so he wouldn't drown on this airplane. And he said he remembered that really specifically, and that they left the hatch open, and he wondered if the hatch was still open. You know, after the fact, you know, spoiler alert, we did make a model of this. We were able to go and look at the model and say, yeah, it is. It's still open right there. And he's like, oh yeah, that's super cool. So again, PB4Y, this video is taken by Mike, who's in the audience here. This is actually pretty good video, especially considering the fact it's shot on a GoPro, right? Yeah, pretty good considering it's shot on a GoPro. We can see the cockpit, but it's hard. It's a little bit hard to engage with this. It's hard to see the whole thing. And this is the conditions that we're working with in Lake Washington, especially when this is before we had all of these big, super bright off-axis lights to use. So on this one, we continued to improve a little bit, and this is the final result that we have of that wreck site of that airplane. So you can see the 2 engines, the inboard engines are damaged. On the right, the number 1 engine is largely intact, and the number 4 engine is also in good shape. And then, of course, at the nose of the airplane, we have the ball turret, which is in almost perfect shape, despite the fact that people have been diving it for 70 years. It crashed, they tried to recover it, they brought it to the surface, they broke the engines off, it crashed to the bottom again, and somehow the glass on that is still intact. So that's what we have. And this is an image of it in somewhat of a less of a dramatic setting, so that you can get a sense of what this actually looks like. It's laying on one side. This is taken straight from the raw data from the scan. You can see one of the landing gear is still down. It has these big blisters on the side that they use, they put guns out of. And then there's a tail turret. The only major damage apart from the engine is to the rudder, which you can see. That actually has fallen off. We have a model of that too, but it didn't stitch together with the whole thing, so we have to add on. The only one thing that I'm disappointed about is that hole. That hole's not actually there. That's from us messing up. So, pretty good shape. And you can see on the side some of the markings. If it circles around here, you can see 21 there, or 22 on the nose. You can see some of the markings on the tail. And right there, it's hard to make out, but it does say Navy Seattle, which is from the Naval Air Base in Seattle. So that's what we've been working on. What's up next? The other airplane that's at the end of Magnuson Park is also in really good shape. It's a smaller airplane, 2 engines, and it also crashed on takeoff, except for in this case, instead of coming to a rest flat, it went straight down into the silt, and it's still resting nose in the dirt today, with the tail broken off to the side so you can peek in the top. This is me taken by my friend Catherine Arant. This is the engine in the silt. And that's another really cool airplane that's in like really excellent shape at the bottom of Lake Washington. The other thing that we're hoping to use this for, another GUE diver down in Bonaire is using photogrammetry to measure the growth of corals, which is a process that previously was destructive. In order to measure a coral, which has all of these little shapes and such, you'd have to take it out of the water and basically dunk it in to measure the volume, which of course kills the coral, and they're a coral restoration project, so that doesn't really work very well, or at least it's not ideal. So what they're doing now is they're making a 3D model of it, and then basically you just say, hey, computer, what's the volume of this thing? And then it tells you, and you don't have to kill it, which is, it's great. So we're sort of riffing on that. There's a new reef that's being installed at Redondo Beach, an artificial reef. And our goal is to get enough folks together in the GUE community in Seattle to be able to go out and make a complete 3D model of this large artificial reef within hopefully a week of its installation. So nothing has had a chance to grow on it. And then the idea is to go back 6 months or 12 months later and document as it goes. And because it's a 3D model, we'd actually be able to stitch those things together and show you growth on that reef over time, or at least that's the goal. So those are our 2 major projects that are coming up. That's my friend Myra on one of the few structures that is in Redondo right now, which is a tube. Anyways, I'd really like to stress that this is a collaborative effort. It's really impossible without a strong community behind you. And basically every one of these models has been created by the hard work and volunteer labor and volunteer cash of people that are just enthusiastic about this. So on this list of folks that have been involved in the documentation project are a lot of divers who've helped dive. They've helped take pictures. They've made models of their own. There are some folks like Mike Racine and Jay Olson who are excellent divers, but instead volunteered their time and the gas on their boats to just drive us places and then sit on the boat while we went and had all the fun, which is like, we wouldn't be able to do it without those people. Like we just wouldn't be, if you can't get there, you can't make a model. So those folks I'm really happy to say thank you to. And then on the bomber model that I showed you last, we've been working with a 3D artist who volunteered his time, Pat Goodwin, and he's been doing just some super cool work that he finished up this morning, which did not give me a heart attack at all, because it definitely was not cutting it close for his presentation at all. But he does great work, especially if he's getting paid for it and I'm not paying him. So, and then also GUE Seattle, Big Blue, 8 Diving, if you're interested in learning how to dive. They've been a huge supporter and halcyon. Also, folks who've done images on the side. Anyways, so that's what we've been up to. If you're interested in getting involved, please let me know. I've got business cards and stuff. Like, we're a nonprofit group. In fact, most of the time we do the exact opposite of making a profit. So if that's something that makes you excited, then get in touch with me and we can find a way to waste your money. Spend your money. Anyways, so that's it. That's the end of the formal presentation. I'm going to try something with the 3D glasses here because I do have a lot of these models in stereoscopic 3D. And we'll just see if it works. I don't know if it's going to work. It might. Oh, yeah.
But I'm going to bring in some of our own Science Center 3D glasses, so those who are not willing to share with their neighbors know.
The IMAX glasses?
Oh, yeah. So if you have neighbors and you know them, it would be really cool if you could share your 3D glasses. And if you don't know them, it would be really cool if you could share your 3D glasses too, because we don't have enough to go around.
So I just learned that our 3D glasses will not work for this.
No.
Yeah. So get cozy with your neighbors. Please share.
Is there any chance we could bring down the lights a little bit more? Awesome, thank you. So I was hoping to have these in the presentation, but I wasn't actually sure if this was going to work, and I'm still not 100% sure if it's going to work. Oh, cool. Okay, great. I actually can't see very well from down here, so. So this is the Valiant. It's a small trainer airplane. It's upside down. If anybody's been to O.O. Denny Park over near Kirkland, that's where this is. It's like a 10-minute swim away from shore if you know where you're going, and a lot longer if you don't. This one is in really cool. This one is in like excellent shape. I think it's really cool because of the radial engine in front is intact. The gear's down. It's a fixed wing airplane, and it's actually it's wood covered in fabric. And so it's remarkable how good of a condition it is, considering the fact that it's literally made out of cloth. On the back, there's the solo cup, the requisite solo cup that's on this airplane. And you can read still some of the markings on the side, although I'm not sure if you'd be able to make them out in 3D.
And so for those in the middle who have 3D glasses and have a chance to see it, if you can pass your glasses to the edges, we have some folks who were not able to see to grab one since we had not enough glasses. We'll re-roll this again just for everyone. If you guys need glasses, raise your hand. We'll help you find you. So up in the back corner, it looks like
You guys want to pass those down?
Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry I didn't bring enough to you. That's on me. Okay, so that guy's super cool. We're going to go through a couple more, and I'm going to have these, so if anybody's interested in seeing them and doesn't get a chance to, just come down and I'll, we'll look at them. Here's a Warren car in 3D.
So I encourage you just to keep sharing those glasses.
It's a little bit on the slower side.
This is weird. What is that?
So this is one of a number of things that we can use, or that we can do to sort of share these models. This is the easiest one because I can do it with a whole audience of people, or at least half the audience. But what we're really hoping to do is take these and build them into a VR scene, because we've seen these models in virtual reality, and it really brings it home what they look like underwater, especially if we spend a little bit of time with a 3D artist to make it into something that looks like it actually looks underwater. So this is sort of the cheap and easy version of that. But it is something that we'll be able to do, hopefully here at the Science Center and maybe elsewhere. So this is Agisoft Photoscan. This is the software that I use to actually stitch everything together. And that ball is used to rotate the model. So you click on it and you drag it somewhere, and it rotates it, although I have it doing a spin animation, so I don't have to sit here and try to slowly drag my finger across the trackpad. But it looks kind of ugly, so I took it away. Okay. And yeah, again, like if you want to see the photos, that's where they're all from. Okay, what else do we have? Oh, okay, so this one's a little bit iffy, but it's pretty cool. It's a little bit iffy in terms of how it came together. But in the middle of Lake Washington, one of the oldest wrecks that we have, and one of the deeper wrecks that we have, usually, depending on the level of the lake, somewhere between 200 and 205 feet, is these coal cars. And they basically rolled off the back of a barge in the 1800s, and they still have the coal that was in them when they rolled off. So for, over maybe 140, 150 years, I don't know the exact date on that. I'm sure somebody does. 1875? 1875. So for close to 150 years, these things have been sitting down there with the coal intact. And there's a whole series of them. This is just one set. Of course, almost omnipresent. In this case, I don't know if there's a solo cup, but what there is a trash bag, or a target bag at least. And the funny thing is when I saw that, I was really frustrated because the bottom of the wreck, or the bottom of Lake Washington, is super fine sediment. So if you disturb it almost at all, it'll come up and it'll billow out and it'll just float in the air and ruin your whole day. But it turned out, so I didn't touch it, I left it in there. But it turned out later that the contrast on the wreck was so low because it was just this homogeneous sort of gray-green color, that the only thing that was able to make this model come together was the fact that that bag was there, because it was so crinkly and stuff. The software was like, oh yeah, give me more of that bag. It was like, I'm rendering a target bag and there's some stuff in the background. And I was like, you're rendering coal cars. Oh, yeah. Question?
Where was that? Where was the
coal cars?
Yeah.
So the question is, where were the coal cars? And the answer is, Jay takes me to them.
How deep?
They're between 200 and 205 feet, depending on how full the lake is or how well calibrated your bottom camera is. So the spinning on this one is a little bit off kilter because we are just in sort of the finishing stages. So forgive me on that. If you want to come and spin it yourself, you're more than welcome to. This one actually works better typically than the other ones because it's got big, it's got protrusions like the wings, and the rudder, and the elevators. So I don't know, is that working for folks?
Oh yeah. So have you tried using drones?
There's a question?
Yeah, have you tried using drones?
Have we tried using drones? So underwater ROVs? Yeah. We have tried using ROVs. There has been some success. So the folks that have been working on the Mars project in Sweden have used ROVs pretty successfully. But what they do is they basically put the camera that we're carrying onto a really expensive ROV, and it's like a commercial operation. The problem is that ROVs aren't actually able to control their buoyancy very well. They're just what we call neutrally buoyant. So if you put them underwater in any place, they sort of stick there, and then they have little thrusters that push them up and down. Now the problem with that in Lake Washington is when you get really close to the ground is super silty, and if you ever stir that up, you're basically done taking pictures for the day. So when it wants to get really close to the ground, and it has to in order to get that part of the wreck, it then blows it out at some point because nobody's perfect in terms of controlling their position, and then it sort of ends up being a moot point. So we've had, yes, some people do, but in Lake Washington it's particularly tricky, and it's hard to do with an ROV when you have any kind of structural complexity. Like you don't want to be sending an ROV under a wing to get tangled in something because they're always tethered to the surface. There is some, the advantage that you can get from an ROV is basically all of the problems that I was talking about earlier that are physiological. Of course, the ROV is not subject to. So I think that there's some possibility of maybe using an ROV to map the easier areas and get the majority of it done and then send divers down for the more challenging areas. But at the end of the day, we don't have an ROV and we do have a lot of divers. So that's what we do. Oh yeah, this is Q&A.
Yeah, and if we're going to bring up the lights just a little bit.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You guys.
Question?
Yeah, so on this picture here, you said that you're kind of bummed out
really there. Do you guys have the ability of the funding to go back down there and redo that portion and then incorporate it in, or would that be a whole new model?
So yeah, we can. We can totally do that. In this case, that particular hole is really easy for our 3D artist to just patch. Yeah. So we can, and we might end up doing that. But in this case, it's on basically a flat section that has nothing particularly interesting on it. So probably what we'll do is just cheat. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, question?
The colors that we see, are those of the object with the light, or are you able to artificially change the colors after?
So the question is are the colors that we see on the model the actual colors, or are they the colors like under the lighting that we use? Or can we boost them? Yeah, so the colors are slightly modified. So you might be on this one. Looks like very few people are wearing 3D glasses anymore, so I'm just going to turn that down or turn that off so I can show you something. Navigation, no view, stereo. Stop spinning. Okay, so what you can see here is that this has actually been constructed of a number of different chunks in the same technique that we have been using on any of the larger wrecks in Lake Washington. So the front nose is much darker because we only had one off-axis lighting diver on that dive and the strobes, whereas the back portion, we had a lot more team members on those dives because that's what was available. And so one of the first things that Pat, our 3D artist, did was actually come in and remove all of the lighting effects from that and make sort of a flat model. And then he was able to boost some of the colors and play with it a little bit to bring it back a little bit closer to reality based on the pictures and reference images and so on, and then add his own lighting in afterwards on what's sort of a flat model. So in this case, this is the raw data. This is no editing, nothing whatsoever, but sort of baked into that is a lot of the light that we have from the model itself. But the more detailed one, the sort of dramatic reveal one, that one has had some retouching going on. There's another question? Yeah, right here.
Yeah, going back to the map that you showed us at the very beginning, the little points of where these wrecks or salvages are.
Yeah.
How do you determine? I mean, do you use satellite imagery? Do you use?
So, that's a really good question. So the question is how do we find wrecks? And this is totally not something that is my doing. This is other folks in the community have done 100% of this work, and they work super, super hard. Basically, the first thing, and this is based on my understanding, first thing that folks did was they looked at NOAA bathymetry that was generated from one of their large ships. So basically they have a system where they can drive through the lake just a handful of times and generate a pretty good model of the entire bottom of it. And on that you're able to see really, really big stuff in Lake Washington. But a lot of stuff in Lake Washington that's interesting is small. So over the years, a number of enthusiasts have been basically going through and doing side scan models, which is a more detailed but more methodical, time-consuming, and sometimes expensive version of that. And then looking on the models, the sort of images that they've created at the bottom of the lake for each little thing that might be interesting, and then marking them on the map. And then we go through, based on the records and talking to other folks in the community that have been diving, and try to figure out which ones of those things are things that we visited before. And then the unknown targets, we go and dive. And to be honest, most of the time it's like rocks or some logs or like a branch that's roughly in the shape of a boat, and that's sort of disappointing, but to be expected. But sometimes there's something really interesting. Like we dove one sort of cube-shaped thing that we were calling Andrea's shoe for a while after Andrea, who's sitting right there. I don't know why it was a shoe. I think it looked like a shoe on the side scan, although it ended up being a cube. And it turned out after some research that it was actually one of the control towers for one of the old floating bridges that went across the lake that had just been dumped there. But it was just a bizarre big square, concrete square that was down there that we found. And folks have found boats and larger wrecks and so on throughout the years.
Do you have any idea of the number?
Do we have any idea of the number? Hundreds? Yeah, depending on how large of a thing you want to count as something interesting. Yeah, question?
Have you come across ones that have toxic stuff, like oil spilling out or anything like that you had to avoid? Or?
The question is, have we come across anything that's toxic underwater, like oil? I personally have not, although I know that a lot of the larger wrecks, like there's a wreck called the Alenduscasi, does have some issues with that. There are a lot of wrecks out there that need sort of remediation on that front, where their oil stores are basically just sitting in there, and eventually they're going to come out. And there are some folks that go out and try to drain them, but that's like a big commercial operation and needs sort of government backing and pretty far outside of our. Yeah, it's definitely a problem. Fortunately, most of the stuff in Lake Washington is small enough that that's not a huge issue. Yeah, question.
Are there any wrecks in this area that are within the recreational zone?
Yes, definitely. In fact, the PBM Mariner that you saw is 70 feet. Yeah, super accessible, and actually a pretty cool wreck. If you get in touch, we will give you a list of wrecks that are accessible, and there are tons of really cool wrecks that are in the recreational range. Okay, in the back there, in the blue shirt. Yeah, you.
Okay. Do you ever have to contend with wildlife on the seafloor?
Do we have to contend with wildlife? No. Lake Washington has almost nothing. Like on a good day, you see like a fish. I saw a salmon in the lake once, and like it looked at me, and I looked at him, and he was like, "I don't know what you're doing here," and I was like, "I don't know what you're doing here." And he just sped off. They're like really fast. I was walking in Seward Park with my girlfriend the other day, and I saw like 5 fish, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I've never seen so many fish in the lake." That being said, in Elliott Bay, there's tremendous amount of life, and a lot of the wrecks are actually so overgrown that they're almost more cool as an artificial reef than they are as a wreck. With some of the largest like rockfish schools and stuff that you see on some of the deeper wrecks. We also, apart from rockfish, we have all kinds of smaller life, things that float around, and then of course our headline, which is the giant Pacific octopus, which if you've ever visited the aquarium, you know how cool and impressive they are. And those just live out in the wild. They're like, enormous, 8, 10, 15 feet across if you'd stretch them out. Just big octopus, just like a straight up sea monster. Yeah, you in the back there.
So other than the ships and the airplanes, what's the most unusual thing that you found?
So other than the ships and the airplanes, what's the most unusual thing that we found in the lake? Yeah, definitely ships and airplanes aren't unusual. We found something that we thought might be a bomb. It ended up being a fuel container for an airplane, so that was definitely spooky, although I'm not sure if that would necessarily qualify as unusual. I don't know, those folks that have also been diving in the lake, have you found anything particularly unusual? Rylan?
I-90 bridge.
Oh yeah, the old I-90 bridge is down there. You just, you can go down there and it's just a bridge. Underwater. That's kind of weird.
A lot of line fights?
Excuse me?
Fights?
Line bites? Line bites? Oh, no, I've never actually seen a line bite underwater, which is a little bit surprising. Yeah, you'd think. Actually, near the I-90 bridge, the modern I-90 bridge, there's often like lots of weird stuff. Like I found a laptop that belonged to the Seattle school district, but it was like ancient. It had a trackball on it. Lots of sunglasses, lots of knickknacks. I think Alex and we found like welding equipment at one point. That was again a little bit spooky because like it's like maybe under pressure, but we opened it anyways.
Swords.
Oh yeah. We found a bottle of tequila that was half full, and then the other half was empty. But we weren't 100% sure that it was definitely tequila and not anything else, so we didn't drink that. And then Alex and his partner Bex, they found 2 swords which is just way cooler than anything I found in the lake. They still have them. You still have them, right? Yeah. So they're armed. Yeah. Right.
We recently heard of an initiative that stitches the photos that are taken by lots of telescopes, and they're trying to make the imagery of a black hole. And they're basically relying on lots of different telescopes all around the world because there's not one big telescope that would take a photo far enough to capture this image. And I wondered if the technology you're using, at least the stitching part, if you've heard of this, if there are any similarities. That's the first question.
Oh, okay. Well, let me field that one really quick to the best of my ability. The question is that there's the image of the black hole, and they're doing some image stitching. I am definitely out of my depth there. I bet that there are some shared technologies, but I'm definitely not doing anything even remotely black hole related. They're way smarter. Okay, second question.
I'm here with my two kids, and I'm not a scientist in any way, but everything you explained is what was crystal clear. I wondered if you took any lessons or in order to deliver your speech, you've done such an amazing job bringing everything down to an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old. It was just perfect.
Well, that was my goal, is to hopefully engage with sort of whoever came here, because I know we have a lot of divers that have as much or more experience here, and then we have people who are not divers, so that's super flattering. Thank you so much. Basically, my experience has just been with teaching diving. That's probably the base of it, and being nervous enough to go over this presentation many, many, many times this weekend. Thank you. Over here. Yes, you.
Is there a difference in diving in Lake Washington and Puget Sound?
Is there a difference in diving in Lake Washington and Puget Sound? Yeah, absolutely. Puget Sound is generally, overall, it's more homogeneous in temperatures. So Lake Washington in the summer, Puget Sound in the summer, the whole thing warms up a little bit. In the winter, the whole thing cools down. I think because of the water motion, but don't quote me on that. In Lake Washington, in the summer, the shallows warm way, way up. So if we're doing a decompression dive, it's really nice because you go down to the bottom, you freeze you get cold, and then you come back up again, and you warm right back up, and you just chill out, and you're warm, and it's comfy. On top of that, Lake Washington has almost no life whatsoever, and the visibility is generally worse. Puget Sound has enormous amount of life. Cold water is just amazing for life because the water can hold a little bit more oxygen in it, and that's really good for the plankton, and then when the plankton do well, the fish do well, and when the fish do well, everything else does well, and sort of so on. So those are the big differences. The temperature, that one's big for me because I get cold easy, but then the other big one is the life. And then the condition of the wrecks, because there's no life, or there's much less life in Lake Washington, like most lakes, most of the wrecks are more sort of right there and intact, whereas most of the wrecks in Elliott Bay are sort of encrusted in a thin layer of living things, which is again why I mentioned that a lot of them are very cool from a historic perspective, but also really cool from just the perspective of they're basically a reef. Does that answer your question?
There's also salt.
Oh yeah, it's also salt water. Not in the lake. The lake is fresh water, but Elliott Bay and so on, it's salt water. Salty. Yeah, you right there.
So on the map there are also these circle things with a number on it.
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't let you finish. What are they? Yeah. So the circle things are we're too zoomed in to show each one of the little points without it looking really messy. So when it has 8 here, that means that there are 8 of these little markers in that area. So for example, in Lake Union, you can see 34 and 48 because it would just basically be a mess of orange otherwise. Yeah, so that's just a number of wrecks in that particular spot that are all sort of merged together. Yeah, in the red shirt there.
Your volunteers who are doing their diving on wrecks, are they submitting their photos to some central place where it's then processed? I'm assuming they're not running this on their home machines.
Yes, we are running it on our home machines.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, yeah. I have built now 2 computers specifically for doing this. And they're expensive, which is too bad, because I don't like spending money that much. Yeah, so it would be really nice if we were able to do them somewhere central, and some folks have done that with the university. But for me, it's much easier to be able to go out, collect the data, and then just come straight home to my own home and start processing it. Because a lot of times it's sort of an iterative process, meaning I have to do it once, and I mess up, and then I do it again, and I mess up, and I do it again, and I mess up, and I do it again, and I mess up. And then 9 or 10 times later, I come up with something that's sort of so-so, and then I tell all my teammates how much of a wonderful job I did and how much time my computer took, completely independent of me, to put it together.
Have you explored doing it in the cloud?
Yes, we have. It's difficult for a number of reasons. If you have more questions on that, I'm more than happy to answer them. But the number one thing is that for a home computer, I can spend the money up front. And in the cloud, we have to worry about getting all the data there. And then they charge us money per hour for every time that I mess up, which is usually a lot, because you sort of have to work with the data, sort of fudge it a little bit. Or not fudge it, but massage it a little bit. Yeah, so yeah. You in the front here. You want me to do the helium thing again? Yeah, I'll field the next question with helium. Okay, I'm listening in the back, yeah.
Any chance that you'll 3D print all these models?
The question is there any chance that we'll 3D print any of the models? And the answer is yes, absolutely. That's something that we're looking into. That requires a certain skill set. So, for example, we brought in the 3D artist to do a little bit of the work. And he really made a big difference in making it look professional. The 3D printing is, again, something where we want to bring in an expert who really knows what they're doing. And we haven't found somebody that we've been able to work with to do that yet. But we would love to be able to 3D print these models. Maybe I need to talk to that gentleman in the back. Yeah, in the front. Question?
You had a slide that had Redondo, and you spoke about artificial.
Oh, yeah.
I have a science background.
Okay.
I'm an educator, and I worked as a camp counselor at the NASC Center. And
Oh, yeah.
So is that, I understand, could you just tell me more about that artificial reef, or is that involved with the global underwater explorers, or it's in my neighborhood, so I want to know about it.
Oh, totally. We are not doing the art. I'd love to claim credit for putting in a huge artificial reef, but that's absolutely not a GUE thing. What we're doing is we're working with the Mass Center to hopefully do this documentation project on it, which is really ambitious, but also really exciting because we have basically a year from now when they first are thinking about putting it in, and we may have an opportunity to sort of do that from scratch, which would be cool because the state is considering putting in a number of other artificial reefs, and if we can basically say look, here it is when it's brand new, and look how much extra life you got a year later, that's a huge selling point, especially because we can go out and visit that site right now, and it's like a dead, flat plane of nothing. It's like a moonscape, worse than a moonscape. Again, I'm speaking, this is not definitely my area of expertise, and there are probably people here in this general vicinity that know more about this than I do. But I think they've gotten the funding and the approval, which is huge, and that took a number of years. And they've got a plan for sort of the structure of what they want to put in. And then within about a year, I think the plan is to start putting it in. But it's a government sort of thing, so it might be a year and a half or 2 years or something like that. It's just based on my previous experience with the government. And then we're working with the Mass Center to hopefully take maybe our 3D models or take pictures or whatnot and get them into the Mass Center. Because again, as you said, there's lots of students that are interested but aren't divers or aren't divers yet. There's lots of people who can't dive for whatever reason or don't want to, they get cold too easily or whatever, and we would love to get those people at least a sense of what it's like to be there. So yeah, we actually had a meeting with them 2 or 3 weeks ago about this, and there's lots of excitement on all sides. Yeah, right there.
Regarding the redundant reef clinics, do you have any concerns about the movement of life on the reef?
Do we have any concerns about movement or life on the?
Well, the life on the reef will move,
Mm-hmm.
and your software is based on the idea that.
Oh yeah. No, that's a totally good question. So the question is when we're modeling a reef, typically our modeling software relies on stuff staying still. And if it moves, it doesn't get rendered into the 3D model. So if we're modeling a reef and life is typically moving, then shouldn't we be worried about those things not rendering in? And the answer is yes. But there are some things that don't move enough for it, or that stay still enough for us to be able to model them in. And the cool thing is that even if we have we'll have this enormous photo set of the entire reef, and even if those things don't render into the model itself, if anybody ever wants to go back and look at any part of the reef at any point during its development, if we're able to make the 3D model, we'll know for sure that we have an image of that part of it and of any life that happened to be there, even if it was moving at the time. So like, yeah, we'd love to, but it's sort of a technological problem. We're doing our best that we can. I saw something in this range. Yeah, you right there.
2 questions. I think it was a few slides ago, but there was a hollow that fell off below.
Car, yeah, the Warren car, yeah.
Did you mention what type of car it was?
It is a Chevrolet something. I'm gonna, again, refer to the experts over here. Somebody knows what it is, right? It's the 28 Chevrolet. That's something that we could look up for you, for sure. I don't know, yeah, we don't know off the top of our heads. Oh, yeah, I think it's a gas car. Yeah, it's a super old, it's like 1920s, so it's like 80, 90 years old now at this point. It's like, I think they were all running on gas. I'm sorry, I don't actually know that much about that. But you had another question?
2. There's 1. Where's the helium? And I'm not asking you to believe it. I can remember in the back of my brain that there's a gas that makes your voice lower.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone know what that gas was?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So like xenon, yeah. So there's a number of gases out there that have different effects. Like hydrogen, for example, is even better than helium in terms of making you clear-headed when you're diving really deep underwater. The problem with hydrogen is it's also explosive when you put too much oxygen near it. And helium is just, we call it inert, which means that it doesn't really do anything. It's sort of like sand, except for easier to breathe. So that works pretty well for us. It's also reasonably inexpensive. But if you're curious and you go online, there are actually studies that are reasonably easy to read, or you might be able to read with the help of your parents, that tell you about when sort of commercial divers in the military was going through and having their soldiers or their sailors breathe different things and see sort of what it did to them. I mean, obviously, as long as you have enough oxygen in it, typically you can breathe. But like, if instead of helium you were to put argon in, which is another inert gas, sort of like sand, it makes you it makes you way drunker, so to speak. It's way more narcotic underwater than helium is. So if you were to dive that at like 50 feet, where you'd be fine on air, on an argon mixture, you'd be just completely loopy and unable to function. Ish.
Okay, so I think we only have about time for 2 more questions. I see 2 Kees here.
Okay.
And then after which we can have time to talk to Kees on an informal basis.
So
there's 2 right here. The gentleman, this one, yes.
Yes.
Have you explored that idea of using other technologies for the photogrammetry purposes, like laser injection
So the question is have we thought about using things other than just photos to create models? We've thought about it, but photography equipment is actually really just easy to come by. I mean, it's essentially a commodity at this point. And we can do this, we have like a really nice camera setup, and we have all of these lights. And when we do it with photography equipment, we're able to put that texture on the model itself rather than just having sort of a blank mesh. But we could do it in concert with lasers, but it starts to become very complicated when you're like, I want to buy a laser scanner, and the laser scanner is $15,000. I don't know if it's going to work, and nobody makes an underwater housing for it. When you contrast that with the, I said early on, we really like simplicity. So that's typically what we'll go for. So yeah, it'd be really cool. We haven't worked on that yet. I'd love to integrate that in there if that was possible. Yeah. Last question, back.
Are attempts to salvage still attempted, or is all the stuff considered historical now?
I don't know of any active salvage attempts on anything out there. There's been some rumbling about salvaging the PBM Mariner again, and by rumbling I mean like some people think that it would be a good idea, but it's like a multi-million-dollar project, so it needs to have a little bit more support than that. That being said, there was a Corsair, which is like a really beautiful fighter from World War II that's sort of like a cobalt blue that typically fought in the Pacific with the Marines. And they brought one of those up and restored it and put it in the Museum of Flight, where you can go see it on display now, to the best of my knowledge. So if you want to see something from the lake and you don't want to go get cold while you do it, then Museum of Flight is a cool place to visit. But also visit the Pacific Science Center. Okay.